President Biden last night gave his farewell address. And frankly, for all of us, too little, too late, my man. You should have gone, I don't know, like 2020. You should have been gone 4 years ago. He obviously is ailing, but on his way out, he decided that he was going to give an Eisenhower-like warning. So Dwight D. Eisenhower, in his farewell address, famously inveighed against the military-industrial complex. I happen to be a believer that this is one of the dumber things that Dwight D. Eisenhower ever said, that the military-industrial complex theory, which was pushed by a sociologist named C. Wright Mills with Marxist leanings, that basic theory, which was that effectively the defense industry drove America toward war, is a fool's way of explaining how foreign policy actually works. But somehow Joe Biden found an even bigger fool's way to explain American policy. On his way out, he warned about a tech oligarchy. Now, let's be clear. The only reason that Joe Biden became president in 2020, at least one of the only reasons, was because of the tech oligarchy working with his people, shutting down, for example, the Hunter Biden laptop story so he could win. It turns out that billionaires disproportionately support, wait for it, Joe Biden and his party. But according to Joe Biden, he's going to weigh in about the supposed this new oligarchy of people who are. Let's be clear. What Joe Biden means here is that people he wants to run the country are career bureaucrats and politicians who have never run a popsicle stand. Those are the two alternatives. Either the people who are going to be left to their own devices to actually hire people, build businesses, and do things are going to be able to run their own lives, or Joe Biden will run their lives. There is no real third choice here. It's not that Elon Musk wants to run every aspect of government. It's that Elon Musk would like the government not to run every aspect of his life. But here is Joe Biden warning everybody about the oligarchy. Again, Joe Biden is the oligarchy. This dude has never worked a real job in his entire life. He's been politicking since the age of 29. He wasn't even old enough to be in the Senate when he was elected to the Senate. And now he's 173 years old, and he's inveighing against the oligarchy that he has been a key cog in for literally his entire adult life.
Today, an oligarchy is taking shape in America of extreme wealth, power, and influence that literally threatens our entire democracy, our basic rights and freedoms, and a fair shot for everyone to get ahead. We see the consequences all across America, and we've seen it before. More than a century ago, but the American people stood up to the robber barons back then and busted the trusts. They didn't punish the wealthy. They just made the wealthy play by the rules everybody else had to. Workers want rights to earn their fair share. You know, they were dealt into the deal, and it helped put us on a path to building the largest middle class, the most prosperous century any nation in the world has ever seen. And we've got to do that again.
God, he's so senile. He's so gone. But beyond that, his idiotic notion that we have to break the modern robber barons, that it's Elon Musk who's really the problem, and it's the tech bros who are really the problem. Who do you think is creating the productivity, the innovation, and the jobs that Americans have? It isn't Joe Biden. It isn't government. This is the key conflict of vision between people like Joe Biden and those of us who actually like free markets and free enterprise and freedom generally. Joe Biden believes that by freedom, we mean the government should allocate to you a particular role in life. Those of us on the other side believe that by freedom, we mean that we should all be able to rise and fall on our own merits, and that generates positive externalities for everyone. Listening to Joe Biden whine about the oligarchy, well, he's never produced a positive thing in his entire life. In his life, he has never produced a positive thing. And then he inveighs against people who actually do the producing, who actually do the innovation, who make life better for literally hundreds of millions of people. But he's sitting there being a complete leech on the ass of society for 5 decades, talking about the oligarchs. You know who's truly an oligarch? Somebody who uses unearned power. Somebody who is given power by the American people to crack down on the freedom of others for redistributive purposes. That is much more of an oligarchy than whatever supposed oligarchy he's talking about. What a terrible old man, and I cannot wait for him to be out of the White House. Neither could the American people, apparently, which is why Donald Trump is going back in on Monday. Thank God, thank God. Meanwhile, Marco Rubio is President Trump's Secretary of State nominee. He gave a just tremendous performance yesterday in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. His opening statement was excellent. It was, I think, really meaningful. He talked about the sort of evolution of American foreign policy over the course of the last several decades. And when he says, listen, American interests used to come first, and they need to come first. Again, this should not be controversial. This should be the baseline.
So while America too often prioritized the global order above our core national interests, other nations continued to act the way nations have always acted and always will, in what they perceive to be their best interest. And instead of folding into the post-Cold War global order, they have manipulated it to serve their interests at the expense of ours. We welcomed the Chinese Communist Party into the global order, and they took advantage of all of its benefits, and they ignored all of its obligations and responsibilities. Instead, they have repressed and lied and cheated and hacked and stolen their way into global superpower status, and they have done so at our expense and at the expense of the people of their own country.
He is totally correct about all of this. And then he makes some statements about the post-Soviet Union consensus of a liberal world order. He says, listen, this stuff has been used as a weapon against the United States. That is 100% true. This notion that the UN ought to rule the roost and the United States ought to be the functioning military arm of the UN is ridiculous and stupid and wrong. The idea that it's in the interest of the United States to allow others to dictate our foreign policy is wrong and stupid. Here is Marco Rubio, Secretary of State nominee.
Out of the triumphalism of the end of the long Cold War emerged a bipartisan consensus. And this consensus was that we had reached the end of history, that all of the nations of the world would now become members of the democratic Western-led community, that a foreign policy that served the national interest could now be replaced by one that served the liberal world order, and that all mankind was now destined to abandon national sovereignty and national identity and would instead become one human family and citizens of the world. This wasn't just a fantasy. We now know it was a dangerous delusion. Here in America and in many of the advanced economies across the world, an almost religious commitment to free and unfettered trade at the expense of our national economy shrunk the middle class, left the working class in crisis, collapsed our industrial capacity, and has pushed critical supply chains into the hands of adversaries and of rivals.
Okay, again, the point that he's making here is not even really an economic one, it's a security one, meaning when you decide to usher China into the world community of nations and pretend that they are a good actor, you're going to screw yourself security-wise and in terms of foreign policy. He made this point again later on while being questioned. He said we need to stop being reliant on China. China has basically made us reliant on so much of our supply chain.
If we stay on the road we're on right now, in less than 10 years, virtually everything that matters to us in life will depend on whether China will allow us to have it or not. Everything from the blood pressure medicine we take to what movies we get to watch, and everything in between, we will depend on China for it. They have come to dominate the critical mineral industry supplies throughout the world. Everywhere in the world, they've now established critical mineral rights. Even those who want to see more electric cars, no matter where you make them, those batteries are almost entirely dependent on the ability of the Chinese and the willingness of the Chinese Communist Party to produce it and export it to you. So if we don't change course, we are going to live in a world where much of what matters to us on a daily basis, from our security to our health, will be dependent on whether the Chinese allow us to have it or not. That's an unacceptable outcome.
He is totally right about that. He also spoke at length about the situation in the Middle East. And he said, listen, if you're talking about Iran, we need to make a distinction. There's the regime and there's the people, and they are not the same thing. This is very important because, again, the United States and its position vis-a-vis Iran must recognize that the Iranian regime is actually quite tenuous right now. The Iranian regime is not a strong regime. They are a weak horse, as the saying goes in the Middle East.
2 points I want to make about Iran, and it's really important. When we talk about Iran, I'm talking about the radical Shia clerics and not the people. The people of Iran are people of an ancient civilization, an ancient culture with tremendous pride and advances. And I don't know who take great pride in their Persian heritage and identity. And I don't know of any nation on earth in which there is a bigger difference between the people and those who govern them than what exists in Iran. And that's a fact that needs to be made repeatedly. In no way is the clerics who run that country representative of the people of that country and of its history and of contributions it's made to humanity. And it's a point I wish we would continue to make.
He's right about that. He also spoke about Israel and Hamas. And again, this goes to what's going on in this hostage deal. He said, listen, Middle East security begins with Israel's security because Israel is, in fact, our best ally in the region and the most powerful military force in the region. The only possible competitor is Turkey, which is going to become a rising problem for the United States and our allies in the Middle East in very short order. But here is Rubio talking about Israel and the Middle East.
We should not underestimate the potential opportunities that now exist, and it'll take some time to fully understand what those are, that perhaps open the door to things that were not open in the future. But from the Israeli perspective, which I fully understand, it begins with their existence, because you cannot coexist with armed elements at your border who seek your destruction and evisceration as a state. You just can't. No nation on it. We wouldn't tolerate it, and they can't either. And it begins with having that level of security. And if they do, then I think there are opportunities that come about as a result of it.
And again, underscoring what's going to happen with this hostage deal. He said, listen, Hamas cannot be allowed to run Gaza. That is one of the big differences between the Trump team's approach and the Biden team's approach. Joe Biden is perfectly happy to allow Hamas to retain control effectively of the Gaza Strip. That is not true of Team Trump, which is one of the reasons the hostage deal got done.
The real open question for the Palestinians is who will govern? Who will govern in Gaza in the short term and who will ultimately govern? Will it be the Palestinian Authority or some other entity? Because it has to be someone. That was the initial goal for Gaza when the Israelis withdrew from there, and they turned it over. And they turned it over with greenhouses, and they turned it over with all kinds of economic development. Hamas won an election. They took over, and they destroyed the place and built tunnels for terrorists to operate from. So the key is not simply governance. It's who will govern. You can't turn it over to people who seek your destruction. And so I do think this is a very complex issue, and I think that's understating it.
Okay. He then suggested, hey, listen, if you support Hamas, if you're here on a visa and you support Hamas, you shouldn't be in the country. And he's going to make an excellent Secretary of State. The Trump team is going to be very different from Team Biden.
As Secretary of State, of course, you'll be responsible for overseeing the issuance of visas. How will you enforce our laws to ensure that we remove supporters of terrorist groups from our country?
Listen, my view on this is one of common sense. Okay, if you apply for a visa to come into the United States, and in the process of being looked at, it comes to light that you're a supporter of Hamas, we wouldn't let you in. If we knew you were a supporter of Hamas, we would not give you a visa. So now that you got the visa and you're inside the U.S., and now we realize you're a supporter of Hamas, we should remove your visa. If you could not come in because you're a supporter of Hamas, you should not be able to stay on a visa if you're a supporter of Hamas. That's how I view it. And I think that's just an issue of common sense. And we intend to be very forceful about that.
Rubio is going to be confirmed likely with north of 60 votes in the United States Senate. Are you tired of the lies and the twists of the mainstream media talking points? Yeah, me too. Join me in my newest series, Fact, where I dismantle and bring truth to this tiring mainstream agenda.